Hello, everybody. It's Coach Rob. Welcome back to another edition of Positive Performance Coaching's Coach's Log. This is my show where I talk about various things. And this week we've been talking about all things FTP. This is the last video in a 4-video series. Actually, the third video was going to be the last video, but it dawned on me at the end of that as I was editing that I failed to mention a couple of things that really thought was important to give to you guys and gals. So in the last video, we were talking about FTP alternatives, meaning alternatives testing. And I even added at the end when to start thinking about the wrap up on your FTP development. Depending on how long you've been training, racing, working on your fitness, you might be able to wrap up your FTP development in as little bit as a couple of years' time, meaning your primary focus is no longer on FTP. We shouldn't have a sole focus. I typically look at 3 performance-oriented goals around various training factors depending on the athlete, but you might have a primary focus. So yes, you might be working on your endurance and your cadence, or maybe your sprinting power, but the primary focus is moving the needle up on your FTP development. So what I would like to talk about is what got missed in the last video. I mentioned power profiling. Now, power profiling, when you take a look at a power curve, whether you're talking critical power or any other type of power, we have a curve. At one end, at the sharp end, we start at the very minor amount of time of 1 to 5 seconds, maybe 15 or 10 seconds, and we go all the way out to maybe as long as 3 or 6 hours on power. Now, most of the software that's out there will probably stop looking at power development around 90 minutes, maybe 120 minutes, but I will look farther afield. If you're working with me and you're concerned with longer duration road racing, ultra distance racing, maybe Ironman distance or Powerman distance events, then you definitely need to have an eye on what power might look like or need to look like at those durations. So a power curve is just that. It's the amount of power that you can have over a duration. Now, the wattage numbers that you produce aren't the only concern. You also need to be thinking about power to weight, power to drag. So if you are a time trialing specialist or a triathlete, duathlete, aquabike specialist, and you have a bike split where you're doing a lot of steady state work and you need to remain aero, you need to have a focus on your coefficient of drag area. This video is not about that. We're not going to get into that just yet. We will in the future. But when we're looking at the power profile, you can start thinking about your discipline. If you have an effort that is steady state and your race is an hour long, then you should be focused on what's going on inside that profile. What kind of power can you produce during the hour, as well as your competitors? Now, when you're looking at a competitor, you have to size him or her up by height, weight, experience, category, age group, and equipment. You may just be getting started. You may not have the world's greatest equipment just yet. Or maybe you do. And you're trying to figure out why so-and-so is able to get you by 10 seconds, 15 seconds, 5 minutes. And you look like you might be the same height, weight, energy levels, experience levels, but for some strange reason, him or her is actually just taking you out to lunch at the end of every race. Power profiling will help. So let's talk a little bit about what a power profile test looks like. Know thy enemy. We've already talked about that. You need to know the course, you need to know the duration, your race discipline, and you need to test on this frequently. Frequently for me, whether it's FTP tests, peak power output tests, and a peak power output test is different. That's kind of a one-time event, and FTP power profiling, some of that can actually happen at will. If you're racing, we can grab numbers from a race. But if we're going to schedule testing, I look to about every 3 to 6 weeks. It depends on the person. If you are younger and you're really getting started, we might test you every 3 weeks just to find out that if we're moving the needle forward or if we need to adjust your training. If you are older and you're an old hat at this and you've been doing it for a while and it's towards the off season, then we might wait every 4 to 6 weeks. And if it's the race season, we may not test at all. We may use the results from a test. So let's get back to power profiling. Your traditional power profile is usually broken out as such. We look at 1 to 5 seconds, and then we go from 10, 15, 30 seconds, 1 minute, 2 minutes, then we skip over to 4 to 5 minutes, maybe 6 to 8 minutes. Then we definitely test 10 minutes, 15, 20, 30, and then usually that's it. Now, can you imagine doing all of that work in one day? You can't. So in my practice, a power profile test is not something that occurs in one day. It's over a series of days. So if we're going to test, we usually test the sharp end of the power curve, the shorter duration, higher intensity intervals first. And what that looks like is this. You go out for day one. You're going to do a 45-minute warm-up, and then you're going to bust out a couple of microbursts, just exploding out of the saddle. How much power can you produce in as short a period as possible? We're not talking about an all-out effort or sprint. We're going to warm up to that. We're going to do 3 of these, and you need to make sure that you are fully recovered between each explosive interval. Now, what does that look like for you? I don't know. I know in my particular case, fully rested means somewhere in the neighborhood of 120, maybe 110 beats on my heart rate. For you, that could be higher. For you, it could be lower. I don't know. If you really want to understand what fully rested looks like, you have regained your composure. You can breathe normally. You can turn the pedals over without any kind of burn, pain, or discomfort. And you could have a conversation like I'm having with you right now. That to me is fully recovered between each interval. So the amount of time that it takes you to complete your test is totally up to your physical fitness, not any kind of arbitrary, time frame. So you're going to do 3 of these. Then you're going to take about a 5 to 10 minute break, really collect yourself, truly feel like you're 100% recovered, legs are moving nicely, and then you're going to break out 2 to 3 30-second all-out sprints. What's the difference between a microburst or a jump and a sprint? It's time and energy. When you take a look and you hear about pro tour racers being able to sprint, and you think about the explosive nature of it, a sprint is not linear. Jump and hold. No, it's more like this. Hit high peak, come back down to a very high number, but you can't sustain that. So, for instance, a pro-level sprinter might be able to jump out of the saddle at 1,600, 1,800 watts, maybe a little bit higher. But when they get down to the 30-second mark, do you think they held that long? No. We call that fatigue. And it's another coach that came up with power profiling or power or fatiguing charts and things like that. We don't follow that much anymore. Usually the thought is that we can be looking for anywhere between a 10 to 20% loss in power over a duration. I'm not a big fan of that because it has not meant a lot in my practice when I've worked with athletes. And I'm not going to go into it here, and I apologize for even bringing it up. But once you've gotten through the 30-second test and you've done 2 to 3 of them and you feel like you really knocked them out and you've got the cobwebs out of your legs again, you're going to rest. Remember, between each interval, fully recovered. So this could take a while. Now, the last thing that you're going to do is a 1-minute all-out effort. What does all out mean? It means that you pace it well enough that you can start strong and finish strong. If I were to look at this in a graph, I would want to see as close to a flat line as possible. Now, how does one go about doing this when it's an all-out effort and you're all over the bike? It's not perfect. We have to smooth out the data to see a line that's probably closer to like this, but I'm looking for a line that trends relatively flat. And you can gauge some of that by past performance. Look over the last 6 weeks of your work, find out what some of the strongest 1-minute efforts were in the last 6 weeks, put it away in your head or tape it onto the top tube of your bike as your notes, and say, okay, well, the last 2 to 3 weeks, let's just say for argument's sake, it was 260 or 300 or 400 watts. And now is the test. You want to put out your best possible effort. You are going to be fatigued because of the earlier high intensity work that you've already done in this test, and that's okay. So what you want to do is understand that in the last 6 weeks you had a 400 best, and you know that that was possible. Now maybe that was done fresh, maybe it wasn't. I can't help you with that. So what you're going to want to do is 2 of those, and that's it. So we might start off with 4 to 5 of the jumps or microbursts that are in the 1 to 5 second arena, and then we're going to test at the 30-second 3 times, and then when we get down to this 1 minute effort, we're only going to test twice. And then you're just going to cool down until you can collect yourself, and you're done. Now I want you to skip a day. The next day you're going to ride easy, and then the day after that is our next round of testing. You're going to do, let's see, probably 2 4-minute efforts. Once again, it's kind of like that 1 minute. What were your best 4-minute efforts just a few weeks ago? And you're going to do the same thing. Warm up for 45 minutes before you start the test. Make sure your legs are functioning. Make sure your heart rate's up. Make sure that everything's warm. And then you're going to do a couple of all-out efforts. And then you're going to rest up in between them. Then you're going to finish up with 2 more tests at 10 minutes. Then you're going to do the same thing. They need to be steady state. They need to be as smooth as you can make them. I do strongly suggest that you do, if you're going to do this outdoors, that you use relatively flat terrain. If you can, and you can stomach doing the work indoors, by all means do so. I think that any time between 1 minute and above can be done easily indoors. The sprint level work is really difficult nowadays to actually do indoors, I think. Trainers being fixed, even if you're on a rocker plate, you're not getting the true explosive motion that you would get when you're outside. The caster effect of the wheels, you're just not going to get that indoors. You might be able to do it on rollers if you're so gifted, but I wouldn't trust them. Now, you have all this data, you can go to the next level, give yourself 2 days of easy riding and do a third test. That third test would be in the 30-minute to 60-minute mark. Most people don't want to go that far. FTP test is in the 20 to 30-minute. You may have already done that. So you could get away with doing the higher intensity block first from the 1 to 5 second intervals to the 30-second and then to the 1 to 2 minute range. Take your day off, then come back and do the your 2, 4, 6, or 8 minute range all the way up to 10 minutes. And then finally on that third day, you can utilize either the data from a race or you can utilize the data from an FTP test to cover everything else. Now, when we start talking about profiling data greater than an hour, you're probably going, there's absolutely no way I'm going to test that. No, I don't expect you to. Instead, what I expect you to do is become a data analyst. There are a number of tools that you can utilize. You can look at past data, past race performance. Usually I like to suggest in the same year, not 2, 3, 4 years ago, but most recent data. Then what you do is you can use things like Golden Cheetah, and you can use something along the lines of one of the, you can either use a formula or you can use a metric where you capture the best data, like I said, from a race or maybe a training ride or a group ride, and you can actually use one of the 3 parameter models to estimate what you might be able to do in the future. Now, what's been interesting about that type of predictive analysis inside of Golden Cheetah is quite often I find that my most current data is actually stronger than the prediction. I think that the predictions, either the model's a little flawed or the model's trying to account for fatigue that you might have. So what has been helpful is that when I need to be able to use that power number from an hour or greater that comes out of that model, is that I can do 2 things. I can look at that model that I'm provided in Golden Cheetah, and then I can take a look at the data that I've captured that's the most immediate. I split the difference. Let's just say, for instance, and this is not not in my particular case, but let's say it says that I should be able to handle 250 watts for 120 minutes. But my most recent data says I've already done it recently at 260. So what I'm going to do is say, okay, I don't think I'm rested enough to be able to hit 260 again. It's only been a couple of weeks and I've got a race coming up. So I'm going to split the difference and say it's probably closer to the estimate or maybe even a little bit lower than the predicted estimate. So let's say it was estimated 250. Then I might say, well, I should try to shoot for 255, but not be too upset if I hit 245. That's it. Welcome to Power Profiling. When we want to look at the data and compare it to others, you can also think of this on discipline. Exert, the product by Baron Biosys, Armando Masachi's product. He's got this fantastic chart that can compare you to your age group or your category along an axis, like a spider web chart. And I'm using the wrong name for that chart, I apologize. But what's nice is that you start up here as like a triathlete or a century rider, and then you go to power sprinter, and then you got sprinter, you got like puncher, ruler, general classification, time trialer, power time trialer. You get the idea. I probably got it backwards there. But what that's based on is your power profile. How do you stack up against everybody else? Now, the problem with power profiling is you're going to start looking this up in Google. You're probably going to see Coggin and Hunter's power profile chart. And I've already talked about this before on this channel and other places. It's not data that I trust. One is it's not age graded. You don't get to see how you stack up against your age group. It's a very large audience from maybe 10-year-olds all the way up to 70-year-olds. And so some of that data may not apply to you. We also have a lot of doubt about the population that was used to populate that chart. I'm sorry if you're familiar with those two, or you happen to be one of those two and you've come to my channel. Get over it. However, one of the things that I have been able to do recently is take a look at the power profiling data provided in the Golden Cheetah product. Now, that's not available out of the box, meaning that you just go to some chart and you create it. No. It's a little bit different. Instead, Golden Cheetah set up a process where athletes voluntarily gave up their data that was anonymized, and people like myself as coaches, I can go in and take a look at that data. So if you are one of my athletes and you're listening to this, let me know and we'll take a look at your various areas along the curve, and we'll see how you stack up against your fellow competitors, or at least the broader audience. And this is data that I trust. So any questions? As always, feel free to leave a comment. By the way, I've been leaving some thoughts of my own in comments and in the descriptions of some of the most recent videos. And if you're interested, there are some giveaways in there. So have a look. Let me know what you think about the video series. I hope this has been helpful. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope that you've learned something from it. If you feel like I've missed something or you want clarification on something, I'm not opposed to coming back to the series and adding additional content. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your training week. I look forward to talking to you again real soon.